All right, I think we might make a start. It is the last week, of course, of semester, and what I want to do today is obviously kind of wrap up the course and bring out some of the key themes again, and maybe have a bit of an outlook at where things are going from here. And if you've been following the news even just today, there's been some additional interesting developments that I'll have a bit of a say about later on as well. So obviously all of this has been in some ways about the intersections between journalism and social media against the backdrop of the broader kind of public sphere, or whatever network structures have replaced the public sphere. We kind of finished last week by looking particularly at the power of platforms in general, and the way that particularly Facebook has dealt with journalism and journalists, as well as the kind of interventions that they can make. Really today what I want to do is kind of wrap this up and wrap it all together and talk a little bit about this term, which I have in the book as sort of a way to bring all of this together, the social news media network. And I'm still not sure if that's the right term, but it certainly has all the components in there that are important: social news media and network. So that's what I'll talk a little bit more about today, what these components are really ultimately, how they fit together or perhaps don't fit together at times, and how they interweave with each other. Maybe give a little bit of an outlook also of, where are things going from here? What are perhaps some of the pressing issues that have emerged, of course, in the last few years? We've seen a few of them already in this course, and what might be worth keeping an eye on as well as things develop from here. Next week, obviously no lecture, just the exam itself, but hopefully it won't be quite such a dramatic experience for any of you. If you've, as you have come to the lectures, if you've read the readings, then it hopefully won't be too much trouble for you to work through it. Journalism, social media, platforms, the public sphere, all of these things have sort of crashed into each other over the last 20 years or so, perhaps. Since the arrival, at least, of blogs and then of more modern social media platforms. And of course, those platforms have kept changing. The ownership of these platforms have kept changing, as we've seen this year, and all of that has had an impact, as well as, of course, journalism itself has kept changing, and the operators, the actors within journalism are also constantly changing. So that's why I kind of, put this together in this kind of slightly awkward term of the social news media network, because it really is a network that connects social media, news media, often in a way that it's not quite clear anymore which one is which. Journalists on social media, are they there as journalists or as social media users? News organizations that are active in social media, of course, what are they doing and how are they doing it? And is that working for them or not? Or is it just feeding more content into the platforms that the platforms then monetize? Really what we've seen over the past 20 years or more, possibly. I mean, the Battle of Seattle was in the late 90s, so it's going back even to that point, is on the journalism side that really journalists and journalism as an institution, journalistic organizations, have quite grudgingly, I guess, at first accepted these tools, embedded these tools into their practices. And this is not something new. Again, we've seen that also last week with some of the points made by James Mees and Eddie Hercombe in their article. Journalism has always been quite reluctant to just embrace new technologies, because it means change, it means investment, it means learning new things, it means doing things differently. So social media, and before that the web and the internet and all other new technologies, have always had a hard time being accepted at first, but gradually that's happened, and often it's been driven by breaking news events, by scandals, by crises, by natural disasters. They're often drivers of change, because suddenly journalists and news organizations see how important these tools can be for reporting on the ground, for getting up-to-date information, for connecting with people who are caught up in these events in some form. And again, we've seen this over and over again. In each country it's worked slightly differently because the scandals or the events have been different, but very often it's been those sorts of things that finally have led to the adoption of social media, of internet technologies more broadly perhaps, as tools of the trade of journalism. And As that's happened, of course, journalists and journalistic organizations, news organizations, have found themselves in these new and uncommon environments that they don't really control, but that are controlled by third parties, by platform providers, and have had to learn to live with or arrange themselves with the logics of social media. And that's been difficult at times. What do you do on social media? How much do you do? How do you present yourself? Do you just push your own content? Do you engage with your audiences who can suddenly engage with you? How do you run your accounts? Do you just have the one account? Does every journalist get an account? How do you make money from all of this? Because you can't really from the platforms themselves. And how do you track the success of your engagement via the metrics that these platforms provide or others that you can generate from your own sites and so on as well? So in some ways, again, what I've argued for some time is that this is not so much that journalism continues unchanged and just uses social media as additional tools of the trade, but that in some ways journalism has become normalized into social media, that news is just something that happens on social media, but it's by the logics and by the rules of the social media platforms. And we've seen that, I think, quite clearly last week as well, with, again, the way that Facebook has been dealing with journalism particularly. So it's journalism living by social media's rules rather than journalism using social media to do what it's always done. And that's been a big change, and not necessarily a change for the better, certainly from a financial point of view for journalism, from an operational point of view. Part of the impact of all of this has been that it's taken a lot of funding away from journalism and redirected it to the platform providers, to the big platforms. And that's a challenge for journalism, particularly when the advertising money drops out. How do you still fund the operation of journalism? And of course, for that reason, we've also seen these attempted interventions, as we've talked about last week in Australia, of trying to siphon off some of the funding back from platforms and give that back to news organizations with limited amounts of success at times. So that's the kind of the platform relations part of it, perhaps. But then, of course, as all of this has happened, there have been some enterprising journalists and news organizations that have genuinely tried to develop new ways of engaging in this space, in this social media space. Finding new roles, and I've talked maybe too much about Andy Carvin and others who've been doing news curation, but that's one of those new roles, in a sense, that's emerged very strongly. New forms of journalism, new platforms, new sites for journalism as well, new operators, whether that's BuzzFeed or Huffington Post, they're sort of a little bit based maybe on the blog model, or others that have really embraced, I guess, the social media space much more directly. Others, of course, that have simply, found their money through clickbait. So really creating news or news-like content that is very attractive to social media users and brings in still a lot of viewers, even to outside platforms, and that you can make money from. So not all of these new forms have been positive or quality journalism, of course, but we've seen innovation in journalism as well eventually as a response to the rules of social media. And part of that, again, I've spent a bit of time talking about live blogs, and that's one of those new developments as well that has been, I think, quite an important way of balancing, I guess, the needs of journalism and the needs of social media users in a way that kind of combines a little bit of both. And of course, last week we've seen with the initial pivot to video that Facebook really forced news organizations to make, and then the pivot away from video again, that video itself has also become important. It's maybe becoming important again, so maybe all that investment wasn't lost, because of course now we're seeing TikTok and other platforms that are very strongly video driven, where that expertise is again incredibly useful, of course. Creating news content for TikTok and becoming really visible there might still be very valuable for news organizations, even though, again, there's a question of how you make money from that. But even if Facebook is no longer that interested in video content, maybe TikTok now is. So it's those kinds of changes that have happened, obviously, as well, and that will continue to happen, of course, sometimes at the whim of the platform, sometimes because someone somewhere in a news organization has a genuinely good idea for how else you could do journalism in this environment. That's the journalistic side. That's the kind of official industrial side, if you like, of journalism. But of course, the other part of this is also that the role of audiences, the activities of audiences, the possibilities for audiences have changed very significantly too. So we've seen news audiences become more visibly active in engaging with the news. They've always been active in some way, of course, reading, watching, talking about the news perhaps, but this has become much more visible because they've now been able to have their say directly on social media as well. Of course, again, particularly when there's breaking news stories, when they're caught up in some event, and they can also very actively contribute to the coverage of news. We've seen that with natural disasters, major crises, terrorist attacks, and other events where suddenly it's the bystanders who are reporting directly from the ground and the journalists are picking up on it. And of course, additionally to, even if you're not directly caught up in these things, you can have your say and you can comment on and respond to the coverage by professional journalists and perhaps set things right if you know something that they don't, or have a different interpretation from what they have. And that's really the more evaluative part of what audiences do. And that really ultimately, if you put that together, is what I call gatewatching, observing what mainstream professional news organizations publish, sharing that where it's relevant, but also commenting on it and maybe putting it into a different context where you think it's not quite taking this in the right direction. So that's really what audiences now do much more visibly, at least. Again, they might always have done it, but what they can now do much more visibly, much more publicly, much more collaboratively as well in social media spaces, right from the start, from when blogs first emerged all the way through to Facebook and Twitter and other platforms now. And that's been something, again, that journalism itself has had to adjust to as well, of course, how to deal with that when suddenly there's thousands of people telling you, no, you've got this wrong, you're not seeing this in the right way. Oh, how do you deal with that? Maybe they're right. Maybe you need to look at your own coverage and change it. Or maybe they're just wrong and misled by some populist somewhere. And in the process, of course, as audiences, as users become active in all of this, there is this phenomenon that Zizi Papakaresi and Sharon Meraz have talked about, this idea of crowdsourcing new voices to greater visibility. So making voices from within that community, that public of people who comment on the news, visible because they have good ideas, because they contribute something interesting. They have maybe an alternative take, or they have some inside knowledge that journalists haven't picked up on yet. And yeah, making them as visible, possibly, maybe more visible than the journalists, the news organizations themselves, by retweeting, resharing, liking, commenting, whatever else might be going on there as well, depending on the platform. And so that's a form of, again, news curation, but by users, by the audience, if you like, not just by journalists themselves, that, yeah, might bring very different voices to the fore than has happened traditionally with mainstream journalism. And it's ultimately possibly quite limited set of people that it tends to deal with, engage with, interview, and so on. And of course, that direct engagement can then happen also by bypassing journalists altogether. So users themselves, news audiences, news publics can engage directly with the politicians, with the experts, with the celebrities, with anyone else who's involved in a story. It doesn't necessarily need journalists anymore to be present in that conversation, although, of course, they would want to, and they're often very useful to have in that conversation, but is also very possible in these social media spaces that aren't operated by news outlets, where news outlets are no longer gatekeepers for information flows in the middle, but that are operated by platform providers where anything goes often. It is possible for these direct conversations. So in some ways, from being the central node that connects the different stakeholders together, journalism and journalists get pushed to the side, and that connection can happen much more directly between all the stakeholders without needing journalists to provide kind of the public stage for this sort of stuff to happen. And that then really leads already on to the question of what happens to the public sphere. And because that's really, of course, the traditional model of the public sphere, where the mainstream media, mainstream news provide this arena in which public debate happens. This space where the elites, the experts, the politicians and others are publicly discoursing with each other, discussing with each other in front of the greater audience. And that's just no longer how things work in this sort of environment. Now we have many publics for different audience, for different sources, for different news outlets, but also for different other stakeholders, and they overlap to a greater or lesser extent. So we've got a network of publics through which information flows, through which ideas flow, through which public discussion and public opinion formation works. And journalism provides just some of these publics, but politicians, experts, celebrities, and others have their own publics around them, and again, they overlap to a certain extent. So that's something that really needs to be still fully thought through. What does that do to the way that public debate works, to the way that we all inform ourselves, to the way that citizenship ultimately works, which depends on being informed about what's going on in the country and in the world. And of course, it's raised these concerns also that some people might just drift off into one particular public or one particular space that's really fully disconnected from everything else that's going on, and for that reason that they might have some very limited bases of information. They might be ill-informed or misinformed even, and exposed to disinformation, fake news, or other sorts of problematic sources, and no longer have the same kind of basis for making their decisions and participating in society as everyone else does. That's, of course, what's been summarized with these terms like echo chambers and filter bubbles, and they've been tried to be addressed in some form. The question for me, and as you know, I'm quite critical of these terms, is to what extent these are really the main issues that we need to address, because overall the evidence seems to be that people are still very thoroughly connected with each other and connected with a very wide range of information sources. It's not that they no longer receive that information, but what we have seen is that increasingly perhaps they're no longer willing to accept a broad range of information that they do see, but come to that information with very preconceived notions of what's really going on in the world. And that's much more about polarization and hyperpartisanship than it is about echo chambers and filter bubbles. But one, I think, aspect that is important in all of this is the power of platforms, of course, to channel information flows and to interfere in these flows of information. It's the platforms themselves and the way that they're designed in the first place and in the way that their algorithms work, but it's also the operators of those platforms and the interventions that they make, possibly for commercial reasons, perhaps for political reasons, perhaps for other reasons, that they privilege certain voices over others, for instance, or shape the flows of information in certain ways, not simply in order to make the platforms work better or give people a better user experience, but perhaps for some very different and much more problematic reasons. And where that's the case, of course, there is a significant need for regulation, for public intervention, for public scrutiny, I guess, in the first place, to see what affects the policies, the choices of platforms and their platform operators, what effects they actually have on what's going on these platforms and how information travels. And again, I'll get back to it a little bit with what's just happened over the last 24 hours in Twitter world, but we're seeing it, I think, with both Facebook and Twitter particularly much over the last few months in different ways, but in each case, you can also talk about the power just of the one person who ultimately runs the thing, Mark Zuckerberg in the case of Facebook, Elon Musk now in the case of Twitter, the power they have over who gets to speak on their platforms and what they get to say and how that information travels on these platforms is extraordinary and possibly very problematic. And that, again, is one of those places where public regulation, government regulation might be necessary and is certainly being attempted, but is also very difficult because of the power that these platforms now have. And through all of this, though, it's not really about news in itself changing in its importance. News remains clearly incredibly important. I don't think we can argue otherwise. News remains ultimately popular as well. You know, not just important in the sense that, yes, you should all know about what's going on in the world, but in the sense that many people do genuinely want to know what's going on in the world as well. They might not always like what they're seeing, or they might not like the interpretations that perhaps journalists make, or might not like the reality perhaps that they're living in, but news itself as a form of content remains incredibly important, incredibly popular as well. But finding quality news, engaging with quality news, working out what is quality news in the first place, that may be difficult at times because of the difficulty in navigating, I guess, the social media and really maybe just the media landscape overall as well, because of all of these rapid changes that we've seen over the last few years. That's kind of the backdrop, I guess, against which all of this kind of operates, and that we need to understand. I did try and find an image for social media news network, social news media network. That's what Midjourney came up with. So I don't know if that's quite right, but it's colorful at least. But so let's kind of just take these four terms in that concept a little bit more one by one. So let's start with the social, and I think this is actually kind of a nice image because it kind of gives a few impressions of what social now looks like. Social maybe in the same space together, but social possibly also with everyone just remotely on their phones and engaging that way, and everything in between, and a few Twitter birds flying around and so on. And it's clearly not just for young people. That's important to recognize as well, that the people who use social media now are really right throughout society. In fact, Facebook is getting increasingly older. And of course, new forms of social media are perhaps where younger people hang out. So this is not something that's just born digital natives, whoever they are engaging with, but it's kind of everyone these days. I'm sure you may all have parents, grandparents who are also in some form, at least on Facebook or on other social media platforms. So this is not something that's limited anymore to a particular subset of society, but really right throughout. And yeah, the social part of all of this is really about the power then of these people, the power of such a broad range of people who are more or less engaged with social media, and the effect that has on journalism ultimately. This is replacing and undermining the kind of privileged position of journalists, as Turner says there. As citizens want to participate much more directly. Can you close the door, please? Thank you. As citizens want to engage more directly in the public sphere, in the construction perhaps of the public sphere, that is becoming that changes ultimately what the role and what the power of journalism is again. Journalists are no longer necessary in a sense for public discussion, for public debate. They play a role, they play an important role perhaps still, but that public debate can take place, especially in social media, quite separately from all of this as well. And that, of course, is also encouraging people to perhaps take the news into their own hands. So, I like this second line there from Charlie Beckett saying, people like journalism so much they're prepared to help create it themselves for free. And that's maybe what we saw early on by creating news blogs and so on, becoming bloggers, commenting on what's going on in the world, even if you couldn't report about it directly. We saw it even earlier than that, of course, with the independent media centers that did report directly from various events and so on. And more recently, we've seen it, of course, with social media platforms where people are, pulling together different news sources, curating the news, discussing the news, crowdsourcing people to prominence and so on. So it's that kind of process, I guess, that we're talking about here. So again, this is about the news still being incredibly important, incredibly popular, to the point that people aren't just leaving that to journalists alone anymore, but get involved themselves. And so that undermines, as I've said, the gatekeeping function, because now it is possible to bypass these gatekeepers. in many contexts where you can share content, everyone else can share content, politicians and experts and others who originate content can share it directly as well, make it visible to their followers. So journalists can no longer keep those gates. They can comment, they can report, but they're no longer strictly necessary for that information to circulate. That is taken care of by the social media platforms. And while this quote is about Twitter, this is certainly the case for other platforms as well. It's difficult necessarily to work out what's a newsmaker, what's a news reporter, what's a news consumer. If you think of politicians, they're newsmakers, but they'll also now report about what's going on in Parliament, for instance, or what their parties have decided, or whatever else is going on in the world. And of course, they're also consuming and often commenting on news reports as well. So, and that's just politicians, and the same goes for pretty much everyone else as well. Now, there is that sort of dark vision of, particularly here, Jürgen Habermas saying it's millions of fragmented chat rooms across the world, the fragmentation of large but politically focused mass audiences into a huge number of isolated issue publics. And, in some ways, yes, there are a lot of issue publics that have been able to emerge through all of this around whatever key topics are at any one point, whether it is at the moment, and these are even too large to call them issue publics perhaps, but the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Donald Trump, whatever you want. But of course, yes, we've seen the emergence of lots of issue publics around all sorts of topics, big and small. But what isn't at all clear is that they're all fragmented, because so often people are contributing, participating, engaging in multiple issue publics at the same time. So often there are other aspects of social media that connect all of these issue publics together. So you're not just in there and you no longer see anything else that's going on in the world, but these issue publics, I would argue very much against Habermas, are very well connected with each other by sharing people, by sharing participants, and also by information flowing between them and flowing around them as well via other mechanisms in social media. So we have no evidence whatsoever that this does lead to a fragmentation. Rather, it leads to a diversification, perhaps, of the topics being discussed, but to these topics and these spaces still being very well connected with each other as well. But yes, journalists have to deal with all of that and understand this new environment that they're now in, where they no longer provide that central arena for the public sphere, but where they need to make themselves visible in all of these different spaces. So they've lost, as Hendrik says, their monopoly in providing information, providing the spaces in which information circulates, and must work out, well, what do we do then? Who are we? What do we try to do in this environment? How do we supply, as he says, relevance and sense-making, capturing, well, the faint signals drowned in deafening background noise, so really capturing the important bits that are going on amongst all the other stuff that is also going on in these social media spaces. So that's the sociality part, that's the social part of all of this. The role of users of all forms, ordinary people, but also others, experts and other stakeholders, who have displaced, not replaced, but displaced the power of journalism and, have carved out their own spaces in these social media spaces. And yeah, one of the answers is that journalists might end up being curators in these conversations rather than necessarily the drivers or the primary source of information. It might be more about evaluating and strategically sharing information, making certain bits of information particularly visible by curating feeds related to whatever these issue publics are about. That might be one way of seeing the change that needs to happen to journalism. So then that's the social part. Let's talk a bit more about the news part, what news actually means in this kind of changing context as well. And the first point is, again, that news remains critically important, of course. News remains, popular, important, people access it all the time, people read it all the time, people share it all the time as well. So this old idea, and you might recognize that slogan from, again, pretty much 20 years ago, content remains king, content remains important, news remains important in all of this. But the way that people engage with it and what we mean by it might have changed. So in some ways, the problem is not that news has disappeared, but there's too much of it and from too many sources. And that's part of the challenge now for journalists as well as all of us. Journalistic authority might have disappeared, and maybe trust in journalism has also disappeared, because there are now so many different information sources, so many different forms of information, so many different alternative views that people can access. And why would you trust one particular journalist when you can find exactly the opposite from somewhere else? And you can't really quite work out which of these sources is more authoritative, is more believable anymore. That's, of course, also what's being exploited by fake news, by mis- and disinformation. One answer to that is not just to offer news reporting, and in some ways news is cheap because there are, of course, also news agencies, and so pretty much the same piece of news about something that's objectively going on in the world will be available from thousands of outlets instantly as it happens. But how journalism can distinguish itself, news organizations can distinguish themselves, is then also by providing better insight into this piece of news, better analysis, comment, collating it, connecting it with other pieces of news. So that's more, again, about curation, although that term doesn't appear here, but it's ultimately also about curating the news, putting it into context, contextualizing the news. That, in some ways, is the perhaps the greater and more important thing that journalists can do these days, because, again, the core, the underlying factual news is cheap and abundantly available. So how whatever an outlet like the New York Times or Washington Post can set itself apart, for instance, in the U.S. context, is not by saying, well, the president said this today or did that today, but by providing the background to this, interpreting this, giving background and saying, well, this is why this is happening, not just this is happening. That is what sets this apart ultimately. So that's the pressure perhaps for journalism, and particularly quality journalism, to do, is to provide greater context, greater background, and through that have a product that people might still want to buy even, rather than just access. And that really, again, some of that is about curation. So as Thorsten and Wells, they say, drawing information in, bringing more information together. Rather than just saying, this happened, you say, this happened, and here's all the background that's connected to that. So drawing additional information into the story by providing that background, that analysis, that interpretation, that commentary, and so on. That's maybe one of the ways in which journalism can still produce a product that is distinct from other competitors as well, of course. In doing this, of course, they also have to deal with the algorithms that make certain news more visible than others. So that is one of the big challenges, of course, that, again, we've talked about quite a bit last week, that the algorithms of the platforms are not necessarily predictable. They might change very quickly as well. They're not controllable by news organizations. So in doing all of this, you also have to produce content that the algorithms will pick up on and make visible, boost and amplify even further. And that might be different, of course, from platform to platform as well, how that operates. But ultimately, the curation part is still very much a human task, of course. And that is perhaps one of the key skills that journalists still have, of course, is to have that maybe bigger picture. Ideally, at least, good journalists have that bigger picture of how to interpret events and put them into that greater context by curating the material around it. And because all of this needs to happen usually very quickly in order to get things out at the pace of social media, one of the big challenges here, of course, is doing this, but doing it reliably, authoritatively, without falling victim to mis or disinformation, without pushing out rumors that ultimately turn out not to be true. So that is one of the big challenges here. And it's also one of the big challenges because, of course, again, this curation and everything else is no longer done by journalists, by trained journalists, who perhaps are somewhat better at this, but by everyone else as well. And that's why we also see that rise in mis and disinformation, that certain stories just look and seem believable, seem plausible, are presented in such a plausible way that everyone distributes them, everyone shares them, everyone adds them to what they're curating, but they turn out ultimately not to be true, and that can also, of course, be exploited. So the question of verification in such a fast-paced space is one that really needs to be much more addressed. Sorry, it's taken to the end of semester, but I'm starting to lose my voice, I think. So that is one of the big challenges that also still needs to be addressed, of course. And we've seen over the last 5 years or so probably more and more this concern about what's been called fake news, misinformation, disinformation, whether for commercial reasons or political reasons or perhaps as interference by other states. This is one of the big challenges. The demand for news is great and maybe is now greater than ever, particularly also in the context of the kind of perma-crisis that we live in. So as we all are trying to work out, well, what the hell's going on around us, there is that kind of demand for news and for information can be exploited by people who provide what seem like plausible explanations for everything, but what are ultimately mis and disinformation pieces. So verifying the content that we see, that's one of the big challenges I think that we are facing at this point. So let's talk a bit more then about the media part as well, and the operators perhaps involved in all of this as well. So in some ways, particularly also, by the way, for this verification piece, the news organizations themselves still matter quite a bit. Good quality, well-run news organizations provide a certain amount of authority and imprint and maybe the mechanisms for verification and for correction as well if they get something wrong, which they do. So all of that still matters and might be preferable to some single operator just doing things. But at the same time, it's very clear that they also have to change in this environment, particularly also under the changed financial conditions. So if the journalism changes, and it does, as we've seen through the impact of social media and the change to the forms and formats of journalism, then the culture of the news media organizations also needs to change to adjust and cope with that. We're seeing already, of course, again, that the practices of news gathering, of news production, of news dissemination have changed, will continue to change depending on what platforms people are on and how they operate. And that clearly will need to continue to change the practices of journalists themselves. And yeah, the ultimately this sort of comes back to the logic of journalism itself. For the last 100 years or so, really, this sounds like hyperbole, but it's true. Throughout the 1900s, perhaps, the fundamental aspect of journalism has been control, has been gatekeeping in the literal sense of the term, almost literal sense of the term. Choosing what gets published, what news gets published and what doesn't. Making a selection that often has been very good, but sometimes has been questionable about what stories are newsworthy and what aren't. And if news organizations collectively decide that a story is not newsworthy, audiences are not going to see it, basically. So that's about control. That's about controlling what enters the public sphere, what enters public debate. And that's in some ways about, obviously, a commitment to public debate and the quality of public debate, but also about a commitment to their own institution, the institution of journalism, and setting clear boundaries of what is news and what isn't. And that no longer works, frankly, in this environment. That no longer works if we're in a place where anyone can publish news or news-like content anywhere they like. Anyone can share it, of course, on social media platforms and more generally online, particularly. So if we're in this sort of logic of openness, of permeability, of publishability, then that kind of control instinct no longer works. Journalism can no longer control what's in the public debate or what isn't. Because we've all got a say in that now, much more than we used to have. So that's something that journalism needs to adapt to. And that's really what Seth Lewis is talking about here. It needs to come to some arrangement with this new environment where it is no longer the ultimate arbiter of what is worthy of public debate and what isn't. And so that again, and sorry, I do sound like a broken record, but that's ultimately then about organizing the news, curating the news, as Jeff Jarvis says there. That's what news organizations will need to learn to do much more in future. Not so much choosing what is news and what isn't, but of everything that we've all collectively decided is news, or how does that all fit together? What are the really important bits that everyone should need to know? That's the curation and organizing part of news that will be important. And yeah, I like this quote by Emily Bell. You know, this isn't, again, simply an algorithmic thing. It can't be done via algorithm, even though some people at Facebook might think it can. It's ultimately a human decision. It's probably a collective rather than just individual decision. So maybe it's not just editorial in the sense that some editor decides about it, but it's ultimately a human decision. What are the important bits of information that people should know about? What should be highlighted? What should be, you know, what should everyone be alerted to, basically, about what's going on in the world? That is a human task, ultimately, that has ethical and moral components, if you like, as well. But it certainly has cognitive components that algorithms cannot solve by themselves. And so, yeah, in some ways, you know, the abundance of content in these online spaces is also an opportunity, because journalism, and maybe Beckett calls it network journalism here, but essentially journalism that is well connected to these flows of information and is able to curate from these flows of information, pick out from these flows of information what's actually important and relevant to be further amplified. Journalism that can do that, news organizations that can do that, networked news organizations, network journalism that can do that, might have a significant advantage, might have a really important role to play, and might actually have a role to play in this space that might be commercially viable as well, which is ultimately always important from the industrial perspective as well, of course. And, you know, increasingly, I think we're seeing at least some news organizations that do this well and that are rewarded for doing it well as well. That's why whenever the Digital News Report comes out every year, and Nick Newman is one of the core authors there, that's why whenever this report comes out, we're seeing that it isn't just random outlets that are suddenly really visible, but quality professional news organizations still have a really important, significant role to play in all of this. They're still the most widely accessed, most, as it says, they're most read, most shared, most discussed sources of news, even in this sort of disconnected, disembodied, distributed, disintermediated news environment of social media. So some news organizations have managed to make that shift reasonably well and still make themselves relevant in this complex global news environment. Of course, that also means that perhaps we've had even more concentration of news organizations, and there's now just a handful globally of leading news organizations like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, like the Guardian, like the BBC. Maybe that's it, in fact. So just a really small handful of really widely respected news organizations that have outsized importance and impact and influence over what news people see and engage with. That may not necessarily just be a good thing, because it might also mean a loss of diversity in some ways, even in spite of the incredibly diverse space that we now sit in. So that's something that needs to be thought through a bit more as well. yeah, that might give them also a certain renewal of what Alan Rusbridger calls journalistic arrogance. Rusbridger, by the way, is a former editor of The Guardian, so when he talks about journalistic arrogance, he's not necessarily a critic of journalism in that sense. He is someone who's been there and who's done that and who's experienced that arrogance himself as well. So, you know, maybe we do need some further diversification to get past this idea that only the New York Times tells us what's fit to print, what is important in the world. Maybe we do need more variety and more diversity in our news environments as well, rather than having this point where, we get back to a point where only journalists can tell us what's important in the world. I think we're probably past that point, and we've lost maybe some of that arrogance, but there are still plenty of journalists around who think that the masses are basically just ignorant, and only they have the authority to say, well, this is what you need to know. That's, I think, still a challenge that needs to be addressed. All right, so that's the media side of things. So let's then finally get to the fourth kind of component, so the social news media network. And that's probably the most obvious point, that we are now very much in a networked environment, in a networked world ultimately, where all of these players, actors, stakeholders, whatever you want to call them, are very thoroughly interconnected, and where, of course, the bits of information, the bits of news are also very thoroughly interconnected and distributed right around the world in many ways. And that's, again, very counter to the way that journalism has operated for the last 100 years, where it was very much in its own little, as Ansgar Heinrich says here, closed operational sphere, and where perhaps news could be cooked up or could be developed, news stories could be developed within journalistic organizations, and were then breaking news when they finally were published. These days, there's a lot more information already floating around, and as she says, there's a very highly dynamic process of information exchange, of course, in these networks. So it's no longer really about breaking news, about exclusive stories. It's much more about, well, a really constant distribution of updates, of news items, of incremental news that might come through. And that's something that, again, news organizations have had to learn and still haven't fully learned to adjust to as well. These interconnected flows of content, all of this information on multiple platforms, in public, in private, and in between, floating around, and anyone really being able to tap into these flows, not just journalists, of course. And again, sorry, Andy Carvin makes another appearance here. But that's, again, this is one of those kind of key models, not just broadcasting to the world, but immersing yourself in that media environment where it's all about the relationships, it's all about connections, maybe that might be a better term even, not just delivering information, but interacting, conversing, connecting, sourcing, co-constructing the news, as Alfred Hermida says here. That's maybe the way to operate in as sort of the spider in the web of this really thoroughly, highly interconnected network of information flows. That is at least one of the ways that you can arrange yourself with that and find your space as a journalist as well, but really as anyone in this environment, and curate the news and co-construct, as Alfred says, the news. So that's then, what Thorsten and Wells call curated flows, and I've probably said enough about the idea of curating, but to me this is really one of the key changes and one of the key kind of developments. So it's journalists, it's strategic communicators, it's individuals, it's social networks, it's the algorithms, it's everyone else, all the other stakeholders, human or non-human, who are overlapping with each other in their curation efforts, basically. It's not just Andy Carvin, but it's all sorts of people who are connected here and are involved in, again, as Papacarisi and Miraz say, crowdsourcing certain pieces of content of certain actors to greater attention, so making them more visible by highlighting their activities and their content. So the maybe to get away, and this is I think useful in that sense. The point here is not just that one thing is replacing the other, of course, in all of this. That we're kind of seeing journalism kind of going away and other things coming along, but there's, as again Newman and colleagues are saying, there is complementarity, there is interconnection, there's layering on top of each other. So it's not just one thing substituting for another. It's not just these things kind of sitting side by side, but they're adding and amplifying each other as well. And that makes the ecosystem much more complex still, right? So this is an influx of new tools and new stakeholders and new practices and new processes, and all of this combining together. It's not just that the old model of news is out and some new model of news has come in and everything kind of continues as it was, but more layers are being added basically through all of these changes that we've talked about all semester. And so that's really what I mean then ultimately, if you put all of these four components together by a social news media network. And again, it's not a particularly brilliant term or one that rolls off the tongue very easily, but these are really the four key components that I would highlight in what we're seeing today. And maybe just as one way of summing all of this up, I like this Charlie Beckett quote saying, journalism is too important to be left to journalists. It's too valuable to be left to chance or to crude market forces. Networking journalism, which may no longer be just journalists, of course, but all other sorts of stakeholders, is not just an option, it's an imperative and a necessity. So networking all of these different forces together, finding a way to productively connect all the stakeholders together and as that network deal with the news. That's now what's important. That's now where things must be going. And are going, of course, arguably already, and have been going for some time. But in all of this, of course, we've continued to see new challenges emerge as well, and those will be with us well beyond this semester and well beyond the coming years as well. And I think for any of you, if you're going on into any related profession or into any research in this space, these are probably some of the challenges that you also will need to confront first off and most of all. So in some ways, of course, we've always seen challenges. So this is kind of, I've just pulled together a few quotes here from 2009, not because this was, well, in some ways it was maybe an important year because this is when Twitter had its big breakthrough. So in some ways this is responding to this and to the realization that, hey, this social media thing might be sticking around and we might have to find a way to arrange ourselves with it. So Alan Rusbridger, still at that point the editor of The Guardian, said, well, this feels like some kind of emergency. You know, we don't really know how to deal with this. Suddenly we're no longer the gatekeepers, but we're just part of a much bigger social news media network and have to find a way to arrange ourselves to find our place within this bigger space that we're suddenly in. Mark Dozy around the same time said, well, it's an inevitable catastrophe that hopefully will not take place. Not quite sure how that works, but again, very much the sort of same emergency and catastrophic kind of language, obviously. This is going to be a problem. And Graham Turner also said, well, the prospects for traditional journalism are looking grim. So a lot of very negative, very concerned kind of voices, particularly at that point when really social media burst into public consciousness for the first time. And you know, we've seen these challenges repeated, of course, more recently as well. In 2016, probably, when you had the sort of double shocks of Brexit, the Brexit referendum actually turning out in favor of leave, when Donald Trump actually won the election, if not the popular vote. You know, people were again sort of saying, well, what's going on here? The world is falling apart, possibly. You know, what's happening here? Why is this happening? How did we not foresee this? Because that was part of the problem, of course, that journalists, election analysts, and others had said, well, yeah, okay, it's a credible challenge, but they're not going to get through, and then they did. So at that point, of course, particularly, we had all this rhetoric about echo chambers and filter bubbles, people being just locked away, no longer seeing reality, and that's simply not true. Leavers in the UK or Trumpists in the US very clearly saw what the other side wanted. They just didn't agree with it and decided, no, I'm going to vote for Trump, I'm going to vote for leaving. So this wasn't about echo chamber, it wasn't about filter bubble, it wasn't about people being unaware of the consequences of their choices. They're being fully aware and saying, yeah, I want that. So that's not something that the journalists wanted to hear, though, because the journalists had not paid enough attention, quite likely, to the people who were so disgruntled that they were going to vote for Brexit or Trump. Of course, what we did also see was significant moral panics about the impact of fake news, of mis and disinformation. And here, yes, there is a good amount of evidence that both of these votes were affected to a certain extent by mis and disinformation, by possibly also intervention from other countries like Russia. That's been, well documented by now. So, of course, there is perhaps some really genuinely, a moral panic that is actually backed up by evidence as well, that disinformation particularly is a real and a growing problem. But ultimately also, again, particularly the news reporting about these two votes did not notice this well enough, did not notice the impact of that well enough, did not really understand well enough what the sentiment was amongst voters who ended up deciding these two votes. And so that was, I think, a real wake-up call for journalists to also have to find a way to better monitor actually what public sentiment and public debate is beyond what perhaps they saw in their newsrooms or what they saw in engaging with popular elites or sort of political elites, and really perhaps paying more attention also to the sentiment of people on social media and elsewhere in the world to understand how ordinary people thought. And that's gradually happened now as people have sort of tried to work out, well, how did these things happen? And went back and tried to understand the communities that voted very strongly for Brexit and for Trump. And I'm just using these two examples because I know you're very well aware of them, but this, of course, happened in many other much smaller cases as well. And frankly, these kinds of events also cause journalism to think much harder about how it actually reports about these different perspectives, whether it engages in what's often been called both-siding, essentially providing false equivalence, giving as much space to leavers and remainers, or giving as much space, more to the point, to people who are very evidently lying and people who aren't. And we've had this with the Trump presidency, of course, as well. Do you simply report what Trump says, and do you report what the opposition says, just equivalently? Or do you point out, no, actually Trump is just lying constantly, and thereby kind of give more weight to observable reality rather than the statements of demagogues? That is a challenge for journalism because it tends to see itself as objective and disinterested and essentially trying not to take sides or trying to present both sides of an argument in the same way. But when one side is, well, frankly, lying, and the other one is closer to the truth, then it's important for journalism to actually take sides as well and present it that way. And that has not necessarily happened, particularly in US journalism, for the last few years. So that is, again, a challenge that journalism still needs to confront. How does it deal with populists? How does it deal with demagogues? How does it deal with disinformation from establishment actors, like the US president? Does it call that out, or does it just report at face value about what the president says? And of course, well, this has only got kind of worse with COVID and with everything else that's been going on in the meantime. We've seen another and maybe even a bigger wave of mis and disinformation relating to COVID and everything related to it. We've seen certainly far more coordinated influence operations. Again, I can very much, based on the evidence, point the finger at Russia here as well. The Russian Internet Research Agency, which is the troll farm in St. Petersburg, has been very, very actively trying to undermine public action to deal with COVID-19, has been stoking vaccine fears and anti-mask sentiment and promoting conspiracy theories. None of this is just hearsay. This has been very much proven and documented in the research as well. So, but it's not just state actors, of course. It's also commercial actors. We've seen, just recently the major court case against Alex Jones of InfoWars, for instance, and against others who've been pushing disinformation, really disinformation ultimately in the US for commercial reasons. So it's become very clear that there is both a thriving business in the disinformation market and and state interference, of course, as well, targeting the US, targeting Europe, targeting other countries around the world as well. And it's not, by the way, just Russia, but there are many others as well who are involved in this. So this is with us and will be with us for some time. And the platforms, to an extent, are trying to do something about it. Maybe Twitter not so much these days, but certainly has been trying to in the past. But they're also fighting a very major battle against the, by now, very well-established and very smart organizations that are pushing this kind of content. And of course, by now, there is a ready-made audience for this as well, people who have been so taken in by this disinformation that they're very happy to continue to receive it and believe it and engage with it. So this is one of the pressing challenges in this space that we still haven't found any kind of meaningful way of overcoming. And really, this isn't, I keep using US examples, but this isn't simply a US kind of thing. This is everywhere by now. Again, I think that I mentioned this yesterday. We've just seen the raids against the Reichsbürger groups in Germany, for instance, and that's another example of that, a conspiracy group that is very deeply influenced by disinformation. And these sorts of people will continue to operate, and it's very difficult to undo what's been done ultimately through this constant feed of disinformation. And ultimately, this isn't just about the circulation of the content itself, but what it does to society itself. So this is about polarization ultimately at a political level, but also at a societal level. Again, the sort of Reichsbürger movement in Germany and other groups like that elsewhere in the world are no longer about particular ideological positions as such, but they are rejecting modern society essentially altogether. You can see this from some of the things that they're trying to do. They simply want a different society, and if you don't fit into that society, they don't want you in it either. So that's a challenge that also needs to be addressed, and that to some extent ultimately flows on from everything that we've talked about this semester as well. So this is what's at stake ultimately. And of course, the last point there, if we don't have strong news media and strong news industry because of the difficulties in finding viable business models ultimately for these organizations, and if we've got powerful platforms, digital social media platforms, that for one reason or another are simply not doing enough against the circulation of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, abuse, hate speech, and all the other things, then this will continue unabated. So this is ultimately also, again, about the industries of news and social media, about the platforms and their operators. So this is about business, and it's about industry, it's about regulation ultimately as well, of course, just as much as it is about the kind of informational environment that we live in and that we engage with. So these are, sorry to kind of sound a very bleak note there, I guess, but these are the challenges that we're all confronting. All of us really around the world are confronting at this point, and we are seeing the consequences that this can have, of course, very clearly if it's not held in check in some way. And this is literally just from today, from The Guardian. But as you might have seen already, if you followed the news this morning, for instance, just today or yesterday, Elon Musk has banned some journalists from Twitter simply for criticizing him, simply for writing negative articles about him. He's saying, of course, this is about, releasing real-time information about him, or sharing information about his location, and that could be assassination coordinates and so on. I mean, this is, incredibly snowflakey stuff, but this is a guy who happened to have enough money to buy Twitter, and who can now decide what journalists get to have a say on this global platform, and what journalists don't. That to me seems incredibly problematic, and particularly when he's just so obviously and so nakedly doing it to silence voices that are critical of him, not releasing any kind of significant private information about him, but simply are critical of him. So this is pure censorship from someone who, of course, claims to be on the free speech, bandwagon, but this is incredibly problematic. And of course, he's doing this quite nakedly and quite openly. Other platform providers might be engaged in similar things, but a little less obviously so. And this ultimately, I mean, my point of view would be this cannot stand. This cannot be the way that such an important platform as Twitter operates. But right now, there is really no recourse here. There is no amount of political pressure that seems to change anything here. So this seems, incredibly problematic. And this is just, a few months into Musk's reign at Twitter. So who knows where else things are going from here. So that, again, just as we come to the close of this semester and of this course, is kind of encapsulates a lot of what's going on here, basically. Platform providers silencing news outlets in order to be able to, more easily distribute disinformation and do so without anyone kind of talking back at them and criticizing them for it. So that to me is deeply problematic, as I said. But I don't want to end on this kind of really negative point of view, because I think there is probably also some hope, and we hopefully have to have hope, I guess. So to give you a few of the more positive voices in all of this as well, as we come to the end, there is, as Russell says, that there's still a market, obviously, for quality news. And this says beat reporting, so on particular news beats, on particular areas of the news particularly, but there is simply a market also for quality news. And many news outlets, but also, of course, many individual journalists who do this sort of thing have been able to position themselves as reliable and well respected and well read news brands, essentially. There are a bunch of outlets that have found a way to operate within this environment, to, as Sheldon says, they make the best of new technologies, new opportunities, without giving up their professional dedication, and are still making quality journalism, of course, as well. The Guardian particularly, I mean, this is Alan Rusbridger again, so he'll talk about The Guardian, of course, but The Guardian has genuinely, I think, managed this better than many other outlets as well. It's been able to also engage with outside voices and give them a platform. So this is less about journalists at the organization doing all of the work. This is almost more like like a shopping mall model or so, where you have different stores in your platform, where you have different kind of spaces in your platform for interesting additional voices. So they've done this with the environment, for instance, where they've had dedicated environment stakeholder specialists, climate change reporters, and so on, who are then simply given a platform on The Guardian itself. In Australia, for instance, they've done it with Indigenous reporting as well, where they've given Indigenous groups a voice by enabling them to have their say on The Guardian as a platform as well. So that's a model that some outlets can pursue as well, and that can be quite successful, because it broadens, again, the range and diversity of the voices perhaps that are being heard, and it enables the news outlets themselves to bring in the talent and the quality ideas and insights that their journalists cannot always deliver, quite simply because there's only a limited number of journalists and they can't be deep experts on everything. So that might be a model as well that's worth pursuing for other news outlets, and some, in fairness, are perhaps trying to do that as well. Public service media, of course, have a particular and particularly promising role to play in all of this as well. They can also be those kinds of platforms. They often don't operate within the constraints of the commercial news business, of course, because they are funded by public subsidies, by other mechanisms that aren't linked purely to advertising or commercial income. So they have perhaps sometimes the freedom to innovate more and to explore more other options as well. So as Ansgar Heinrich says, they can be supernodes within this evolving, globalized network journalism culture, and find other ways to bring in outside voices and outside information, interactive practices of news gathering, production, and dissemination. That's sort of the idea here that might be pursued, particularly by these operators, which are different. And in some ways, by the way, The Guardian is kind of different from standard commercial media as well, because much of its funding comes from a trust fund, comes from an existing significant amount of money, rather than having to be made over and over again by commercial activities. And that's, you know, the problem is how does this happen elsewhere? Not every news outlet can be funded by trust funds or by public money. So how do we support something that society needs, news, quality news, when the market itself can no longer do that, because most of the funding ultimately goes to the news, goes to the platform providers, not to the news organizations. That is, of course, again, where also this idea of siphoning off some of the money from platforms and redirecting it to news organizations comes in. And as we've seen, that's been tried in Australia with mixed success, and is being tried now in Canada as well, so we'll see how that goes. But this is, again, getting back to that question, well, is there a way, perhaps, in a more meaningful and more sensible way to redirect some of the money that the platforms are now hoovering up and redirecting that to the people who produce the content, to the news organizations themselves, but then also to which of them, in what way, under what circumstances, and so on. So this is not an easy thing to get right. And so far, I don't think anyone's really quite got that right. But again, to maybe kind of end on a pretty positive note here, as Brian McNair said, journalism is not going to die out in all of this, because news itself is just needed and is so important and so popular ultimately as well, as we see. Journalism, he says, has a future, and hopefully that is the case, but it's not a future that will just appear. It needs to be fought for, it needs to be developed, it needs to be pursued, and it needs to be really developed and created within the context of the world that we now live in, which is not necessarily friendly to news organizations. It might be still very interested in news, but it might not be very friendly to the producers of news. So that question still needs to be worked out, and needs to be worked out in much more detail and with much more creativity, I think, than we've seen so far. So again, to have maybe a more positive quote here from Seth Lewis, he says, good societies are engaged societies. They are robust and active, dialogical and diverse, freely sharing ideas and information. We might think of this as a networked variation of Habermas's idealized public sphere, featuring the same animated deliberation, but with a network arrangement that's more horizontal and more peer-to-peer and more representative of marginalized voices, as opposed to the kind of Habermasian view of the coffee house, which is basically just old white males sitting together and talking about what's going on in the world. So, you know, that would be perhaps, that's maybe a vision that we can all subscribe to, perhaps, I don't know, but again, it's not going to just appear by itself. So we need to work towards that, towards spaces that are actually active, dialogical and diverse and freely sharing ideas and information not overrun by trolls and bots and abusers and controlled by powerful individuals like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, and influenced by mis- and disinformation actors. So this is not something that we have at this point, but it is, I think, a good aim to have, to work towards as well, and something that we urgently, I think, also do need to work towards in order to, safeguard, well, democracy, society overall, I think, as well, given everything that we know about what happens when this is no longer the case. It's no longer available to us. And so, again, sorry, this is Midjourney, again, trying to generate an image of the social news media network, I think. And it looks nice and very harmonious, at least. So there you go. Maybe that's sort of what we aim to work towards. Everyone holding hands or something. Maybe not quite, but yeah. So that's, I think, where we'll leave it, and really where we'll leave these lectures in the semester. So thank you all again for being here right to the end, of course, as well, and for coming along on this. I hope that's been useful as sort of a one-off thing, of course, that won't be repeated in the same way because I'm only here for this semester. Thank you all, and I won't see you again, but maybe eventually down the track in some other context we'll run into each other again. So thank you all, and good luck with the exam as well.